Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural episode of In the Wild with VulnCheck. I am Kimber Duke. I have with me Patrick Garrity and our
What's up?
first guest of the season, Kale Black, one of our exploit researchers on the initial access team. He's also the team lead of that. Welcome, Kale.
Hello, hello.
What's up, Kale? How are you?
Pretty good. You want me to start with some introductions then for myself?
Please. I think
Perfect.
everybody knows who Patrick and I are, but just in case, I'm Kimber. I do product things here at VulnCheck, and Patrick.
Yeah, I'm Patrick. I do research things.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm Kale Black. I'm the initial access exploit developer and team lead. I kind of come from a penetration testing background. I did that for about 12 years, and I say I'm reformed from that. No more writing reports and focusing more on the exploit side of things. So, yeah, that's me in a high level overview, and I'm happy to talk about exploits all the time. So, if anyone has any questions, please feel free, and I can dive into any of these at any point.
Yes, hence the title, Tales from the Exploit Mines, because that's pretty much what Kale does every day, is goes to the exploit mines, mines up some exploits, more
I,
or less.
Yeah, a lot of our work is going through 0 days and in days that come through our feeds and stuff like that, and kind of try and do reproduction of that. I think a lot of the conversation today is going to be about like some of what that actually entails and what that means for an attacker versus some of the things that you see coming through from the blue team side of things, because our perspectives end up being quite different.
Yeah. And I think that's really one of our goals probably with this webinar is to just start getting like different perspectives around vulnerabilities and not just like the vulnerability management side of things, but the exploit development side of things, how people are looking at things in the wild. Right, Patrick?
It's great. Yeah. So I think today we're going to spend most of our time talking about Gladinet Trio Fox and specifically CVE 2025-12480, which is an RCE.
Catchy names.
Um, before we hop into the technical details, though, like Kale, do you want to give us some sense of like this software and what it's used for?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that immediately stands out with a component like TrioFox is file servers are just a favorite target of attackers, especially anything that might be internet facing, anything that's holding anything valuable documents, anything similar to VPNs. Always are a high value target for attackers. They want them for ransomware. They want them for the fact that they're oftentimes overprivileged. And so TrioFox immediately stands out because it's kind of an all-in-one drop-on solution for like Windows platform stuff for just any sort of file stuff. And it's also pretty complex. There was a lot going on with it. So seeing some vulnerabilities kind of trickle into our feeds wasn't shocking, but a few things stood out to us in these ones. So TrioFox has a few other products that all seem to be similar based on it. These come into our feed. We see some exploitation happening and some discussion going on about these, and we kind of just dig in, see where we can find in the vulnerabilities. They didn't give us a lot of information. I think this one specifically came out with a pretty much a warning on a banner, and there was a lot of back and forth with CVE assignment and things like that, because it's not always the vendor handling some of that component because things were being attacked in the wild at this time. And so TrioFox kind of is a high value target, being a file server system. I mean, documents are what people want.
I think
Great.
there was some discussion earlier of like, I have never heard of Gladinet Trio Fox. What would you say to people who say the same thing? I've never heard of this software that might be tuning in.
I mean, file servers are something that end up getting done a lot. People want to transfer not only just files internally in kind of seamless ways, but between external parties. And they end up, oftentimes, secure file transfer servers just become something that businesses end up developing and wanting in general. So they will oftentimes get a commercial off the shelf product. There's tons of options out there, and there's more and more every day. It seems like I didn't know much about TrioFox. I hadn't seen it. It seems to have a pretty wide user base, a lot bigger than I thought it was when we first did it for the analysis part of it. But that was any large company that ends up wanting to transfer documents between even orgs ends up getting something similar to this, or developing in general. So that's a pretty common thing that we see in enterprise environments.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are there much
I noticed, right? It's like going to their website. It's like, oh, they have NASA, Red Bull, Ericsson. I mean, large global entities, government entities as clients, and I think too, a lot of times on the file server side, um, I think it is a bit shocking how pervasive these products get used, and maybe any software. But I think we've seen this many times with like Crush FTP and other vendors as well, where like you just never heard of them, and all of a sudden
yeah.
it's a logical point where an attacker is targeting.
Yeah, some of that can also be extended to just the attacker logic too. Like if you're thinking of the fact that something is holding sensitive documents, you're going to go look for all the ones there. And if there's things that people haven't looked at before, they oftentimes become new targets for that kind of stuff because no one has looked at them and they've discovered that, oh, they're widely deployed, but no one's done that much vuln analysis. Great. Those are perfect targets because if no one's looking, there's a good chance that no one's found anything yet. Which is also why you see these stack vulnerabilities. When you see one product suddenly has like 20 vulnerabilities when they hadn't had any for years, it's because suddenly people are looking.
That's what we saw with Move It for sure, was like people started realizing that like, oh, Move It exists and let's have some fun with that. I was gonna ask earlier, are most file transfer softwares the same? I mean, I think of like FTP, SFTP when I think of these things, but like overall is they're all similar?
They have a similar goal. I wouldn't say that they're all the same. I think that it ends up being a very much a business use case. These days, you see a lot of like web-based ones that tie into FTP or any of those ones. So people have just like a web server they can log into, but then they can also use their automated tooling for SFTP and things like that. The market share for that has changed a lot. It used to be that people only deployed like SFTP servers directly on the internet and transfer between those whenever they needed like business use cases. But a lot more and more these days, if it's like, oh, we need access to the internal network share that's on a Windows server, and we want to put that on the internet, but we don't want to put it in the cloud for some various reasons or things like that. It tends to be a lot of web focused components.
Kale, not the rest of the world doesn't all use a terminal all day long.
Cowards.
I learned a new
you would like to
term
believe that
yesterday.
everyone should just live in the terminal, but I
I
have to
I
remind
learned
you.
the term TUI the other day. TUI, like a text user interface. I didn't know that was a thing. Sorry, just total tangent there. But I'm installing the Discord TUI because like that's freaking sick, man.
All right, well
Uh
let's hop into some of the details on this one. So I think we'll start off. I think one of the things you pulled up was, hey, Mandiant published exploitation attack chain. And I think you had some observations and differences of what you saw in reality from what was outlined here.
Yeah. To preface this a little bit, this was originally a Mandiant's. I believe it was a threat report blog that they did about this. That they saw that UNC 6485 was actively exploiting this. So that this was kind of seen initially fired in the wild by their team. They kind of published this infographic about what was going on inside of that. That was kind of their high level exploitation chain of kind of what was going on, what they saw on their feeds. I looked at their IOCs and started noticing some interesting patterns with that. And so, for the context to our initial access team, one of our goals is to try and write these exploits like that, like as close as possible to some of the threat actors. If you go and actually look at some of the write-ups on this vulnerability, like from Attacker KB and stuff, the researchers who did some of the independent research for like what this is actually probably found some faster paths than what the real attacker and threat actor was using. They were actually probably a little bit more clean for exploitation. But when we saw this, I immediately thought to myself, I wanted to try and replicate what that threat actor was doing, partially because our initial access team develops artifacts for each of these exploits. We kind of start from exploits from a first principle. We don't think you can make good detections without having an understanding of some of the exploitation steps that are involved, partially because of like bypasses for signatures or being way too specific with your detections. So we wanted to see what the steps would actually take to copy that, so that when we created our artifact package and exploits for our customers, they could end up having the ability to detect each of the different parts of these and the components with that. So instead of taking the potentially better path that some of the other researchers had found that was much quicker to the attack path, we decided that we were going to kind of follow the exploitation chain. And what that kind of ended up revealing was that there's a lot of just statements. A lot of people say that you just need to do this, and some of these statements in this graphic are kind of leading some far more complexities than what we see in real life. If you
The,
actually, yeah.
I was going to say, this looks like very simple and straightforward looking at this graph.
Yeah, and frankly, this is probably what their defenders saw. They saw something very much like this. They saw that the steps were involved here. And to a defender, this is what this might look like. But when you
Oh, that makes a
contextualize,
lot of sense.
yeah. Yeah, these are just logs from web's traffic and anything that they captured for their EDR tools and things like that. They end up filtering through that. And some of that can belie some of the real complexities attackers have to deal with, which also can belie some of the other more subtle defensive techniques that you might have to employ when you're developing like exploitation against a target like this. For example, like that admin database section is one request. And as you're going to see, it's that was hiding quite a bit of complexity in that one request here.
Yeah.
You want to hop to the
Yeah.
actual?
Yes.
So if you
The
want to actually
kale
look
version
at
of the
what
graph.
actually happened, the requests were a little bit more complicated than a 5-step process. It included quite a bit more of the actual involved steps with this. So while they might have only seen a couple of steps in those for the detections, and those are probably the important ones, the attacker ended up having to do quite a bit more steps involved. I think the whole final path was 29 requests
Wow.
for us to actually reproduce this, and included a bigger complexity of we actually had to embed an entire PostgreSQL rogue server that would call out to the component. So there is a huge part missing in that last graph where they have to actually set up a whole server to let the server connect back. If you actually look at the way that the attacker did this, is there was a simple bypass in the authentication mechanism for the web component that ended up letting an administrator access remotely. Essentially, during the setup of the process, you have to set up a database and do all the helpful wizard setup that is done in a lot of these enterprise products. They unfortunately did not properly validate one of their headers, and it let an attacker reach that setup point from remotely, even if the database had been configured. So the attackers figured out you could reach that database to reset the page, and then go through the whole setup process in the actual Trio Fox system. So because of that, they ended up actually bypassing the admin setup, and they had to go through the whole wizard process for setting up a database and then setting up an administrator. What that missed is that had to actually reach out to a database. If they used the embedded database that was handled by TrioFox, it would actually fail, and they wouldn't be able to get to their administrative portion in that. So if real attackers, when they're actually going after this TrioFox system on the internet, had to set up an actual database that the system could connect back to. That's a huge missing component of that graphic, because with that, they're going to have to send a lot more traffic to a remote database. The attacker has to set one up. It's going to be easier to potentially fingerprint and components like that. So for our exploit, what we ended up doing was following that same path. We get to the administrative reset page. We set up PostgreSQL server, and on the backend attacker server, we did this embedded in all of our Go exploit framework in a single package. There's some awesome embedded packages for PostgreSQL. So if you ran some of our initial access artifacts, they would spin up a PostgreSQL server that would start up at runtime, and then it would do the reset at the database. And then the requests for connections and setting up the database would happen to that. And then eventually the attacker finally follows through all those steps. So the entire left side of the column of that then actually sets up the user account that is controlled by the attacker. And then they have administrative access to that. Meanwhile, the whole TrioFox server is actually running off the attacker SQL server. And then the complexities start to compound even further on this, because each of these, since TrioFox is an ASP application, it has to keep state with each of the ones. So you end up actually having to, via API calls, actually simulate some of the clicking on objects in order to keep the updates happening. So the mandate stuff missed a lot of the interactions that might have to happen between all of that were just kind of assumed to be proper behavior and not some of the attacker components. So with that ended up actually being rather interesting for how the amount of requests that were required for this, but also because if you go back to the other graphic real quick, Patrick, there was actually some post exploitation stuff that was also missed because that far right antivirus setup page to configure, execute malicious payload, that was the entire right portion of the next page. So in the next page, that pretty much all three of those right columns are represented with that button, single, like just execute here. There was a lot more complexity inside of that on top of the other things that were missed. For example, that in order to actually trigger the antivirus with the malicious payload, the payload itself had to be a single bat file. So we had to set up the malicious file had to get uploaded to the document. We had to reset the AV antivirus system. And then we had to upload something that would trigger the antivirus with our malicious payload, which would then trigger the actual payload and then proxy up the data from there. And then on top of that, because one thing that was not called out that we noticed in this too is this requires the whole time this is working off the attacker SQL database. So all the requests and components that are going to that are just calling back to the attacker system. So if at some point the attacker decides that they're done, they clean up the database, the TrioFox system is going to be completely dead on arrival. They're not going to be able to interact with their system. It's completely no longer has the information there. So it's very clear that something has happened to a defender. So with this, I assume this was probably a smash and grab by the actual threat actors. I'm not certain. We don't have a clear history with that component, but I suspect it was that. Of course, I want to overachieve a little bit, so I took it a little bit step farther and said, how could we potentially get this reset back to the other database that was previously there? And so we took that and actually added a whole reset database stage, because we realized that if you went to the admin reset page again, that whole left workflow, you could end up actually resetting it back to the original state, and the database that was embedded with the TrioFox system would end up still being in the original state that was there, and it would be back up. So we figured out that you could essentially turn this into a remote code execution that resets the system and then restores it back to the original state if they were using the embedded state in that. So there was a whole lot of interactions with these that were just very much, I don't want to say missed, but we're belied some of the complexities. And I think that when you think about things from an exploiter and attacker perspective, you start seeing some interesting connections between these types of things that might end up being missed and might actually help defenders look for these in the future.
Yeah,
hey,
because
sorry, go ahead.
I'm looking at this graph, and especially keying on that idea that the attacker has to have their own pSQL server set up to this. Judging by some defender actions that I've evaluated in the past, there's usually just an open port for communications to those things. It's not locked down to you have to be talking to our server. It's just you have to be talking to the server or the server in this range of IPs or something like that. So I see so many opportunities for better detections highlighted just from breaking it down in this sense.
Yeah, there's also one of the big things with file servers too is oftentimes they're difficult to update and stuff because they might have some specific integration or things that they really need between their clients to work. And so people are a little bit hesitant to update things. So they end up being a little bit behind on some of those. And you can immediately see some potential protections and gates you could put up here that for the blocking the outbound database connections and doing some blocking on those administrative pages and stuff that might not have been noticed if you didn't actually go through the whole exploitation step, because an entire rogue SQL database server connection could potentially be a pretty good indicator of potential compromise.
Yeah.
And these are ASPX server or file extensions, so are they Windows machines in that case?
TrioFox system only works on Windows from what I saw in their data sheets. So it is oriented around Windows.
Really easy to deploy.
Yeah, if you read our blog
Um,
too, there was some really interesting components about how we had to actually simulate doing file upload using the UI and components like that. We can actually walk through some of that too.
Hey, I have a question like timeline, like you went and worked on this. How much time did it take to be able to successfully complete this exploitation chain?
We had to figure this out, so this was entirely by hand. All we had to use was kind of the context clues of what we were able to glean from the Trio Fox, from the original Mandiant write up. So in the end, we ended up. It took me about 3 days total post setup of the target to get this working. So it was about 3 days of work. I will say it was once I figured out a better way to handle some of the ASP state management with Go exploit, which we integrated into it. It was a lot faster. You just have to simulate what it is. I captured these in a web proxy, and then I kind of just walked through manually what I would expect the process to look like, and sure enough, it kind of works. So that was kind of the whole. It was about 3 days of work, a day of code review from my team, and then we got it merged in. So about 4 days total, I would say, of work,
Yeah.
which was it was pretty quick, I will say, for this one. I was with the 30 some requests in the end. It was we expected it to take a little bit longer. It was just lucky, I think.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious too for context on like the threat actor side. It's like it like if I look at this from the outside, it's like it would appear that probably they identified this as a target first, high value target, and then we're like, hey, how do we exploit this thing? Got hands on software likely, uh, but didn't have the breadcrumbs you had. So I assume this could have taken a lot longer to even develop.
Yeah, it very much could have, and it definitely probably did, because that first initial exploit of the admin reset database thing was probably something someone actually sat down with decompilers and figured out that step was there. That actually is part of the hard part that we get lucky about, because we know that vulnerability already exists, so we don't have to go through that step. We can essentially skip that part, and so they might have taken longer to develop some of the components to it too. And we also don't know everything that they exactly did, because we only have a certain set of IOCs that were given from Mandiant in the first place. So a little bit of this is guesswork, but I suspect that they knew that you could change the antivirus software component to that, and that was an immediate red flag for them. That, well, if we control the file server, we can upload something, and they can figure out some of those steps just logically. But I think that you're right, that their very first step was realizing high value targets. They've got some good logos on their things that are perfect types of
Hmm.
targets for this sort of thing, and then they probably found a couple of bugs. And it's not unlikely that they didn't have other bugs too. But if this one strikes me as a smash and grab, so they were probably either setting up something for ransomware, or for just specifically going after pulling off as many documents as possible. So they had that in mind when they did it. So they probably were able to be a little bit more aggressive.
Yeah, the
Cool. Do you
ASPX stuff reminds me of like the same kind of like similar patterns to when we see SharePoint getting exploited. Like just anything that's set up in Windows in that way, like you can kind of there's like these common ASPX files that will be accessed, and you can kind of regularly see those be accessed in real time when people are interacting with your file sharing server. But like there's these things that I would not expect to see, like init account or admin database. So I think there's also some other really good detections in there of just being familiar with your file structure of how your program operates and what it's calling on the regular and what is irregular. Because this would I would think that this would like really stand out in the logs when you're looking at the software.
Yeah, that entire two left columns of these steps probably you shouldn't see happening pretty much at any time prior. So those types of ones stands out. Having a normal set of corpus is always a good idea to know what you're looking for like a normal day to day operation.
Yeah.
I mean, there was some interesting things with this too, because you pointed out ASPX things. I mean, for attackers, what immediately stands out in my mind is, oh, I'll just upload some ASPX thing and it'll work. That is not how this one worked. We ended up having to work quite a way around a few things that I'm sure we can get into if we want to talk about for some of these. I always say that these are kind of like just statements. People are like, just do this, just upload ASPX, and some of those things might have a lot of complexity and just reset the database, like that were pointed out in some of the Mandiant things. And for example, like when we actually want to trigger this, it just said to reset the database in the Mandiant write-up, but there wasn't actually anything about what those steps look like. So like there's quite a few options here. Like the attacker may have just used Amazon S3 for some of this, and the reason we didn't see some of that is because they had an S3 bucket that they were using for this dumps. But I wanted to try and keep everything local in ours, so I kind of took a different path and just figured out what would resetting the database look like and what would it actually like let us have access to on the local system that we could use for exploitation in the future. So like those just statements really can oftentimes hide real complexity. So Patrick can go to the next bit on this one. Like, for example, they said the attacker uploaded a set of payloads to the system. One of the things we immediately like noticed when we're actually stepping through this to see what that process would look like is that the file system didn't actually let you mount any of the components because TrioFox both checked its own access things or allowed NTFS permissions. So we actually could not initially get access to just like, I was like, oh, I'll just set C as the location for the file share to be in when I'm setting up the database. And so like the real user would see this. Obviously ours is all automated in our exploit, but the real user would see this. And we actually could not get this to work in a way that it would mount the system. It would give permission errors if you actually tried to mount C TrioFox with the permissions there. So we had to end up thinking about, well, what's a different way to mount? So we had to go through the whole system and figure out the different mount paths that were there. So instead of just mounting the system and assuming that it was going to work after we tested and it failed, we can go to the next page. We ended up discovering that that would throw an error because it would say that it's not an AD user because it was an embedded TrioFox. And the only way to get the AD user to work would be to actually pass credentials. Which I was like, obviously I'm an attacker. I don't have AD credentials on these. So I need to find a different path, which I think is the next slide. And that is when we discovered that it was a set of like home directory functionality so that like every user would have their own special directories in the system. And so instead of mounting the file system server path, we went for this instead. And it turned out that would actually not do the same NTFS checks for AD. It would actually set it up as the TrioFox user without having to have a set of credentials. So if you go to the next page, we then had to work around that personal drive is enabled. So if you actually go through and look at our steps that we took involved, instead of like just mounting the C drive for that, we ended up enabling that as home drives and set the local storage for home drives to be the C directory for the local storage. And then that actually just gave us direct access to this underlying system underneath for uploading targets and things like that. That part was completely missed from any analysis I saw. I couldn't find anyone doing anything with that because I assumed it would also just work, to be completely honest. And from all my testing, I couldn't find a few ways. We had to find a path around. And then from there, we can actually start doing some of the other just statements. Those are all represented here. The ASP state is each of these. So during each of these requests, we actually have to keep the state for, if you've ever touched ASP applications, they oftentimes have like these event view states that request for each time. So in exploitation, oftentimes when we're using these scripting tools, it's kind of a little difficult to handle like cookies and sessions and data that are interacted with a web application. Most of us try and minimize our exploitation so that it's just the bare minimum that's required. Well, when dealing with an ASP application, that's not always the case because you have to keep the state for all the little pieces. So like whenever you click a button, it updates the state inside of a cookie. And so we have to also handle that. So we wrote some tooling to automatically handle that, but it's not something that's easy off the gate. And the attacker would have to handle each of those requests of extracting cookies and things like that. We automated that out, so it was all kind of done in our Go exploit framework, and then integrated it in the open source framework for that. so that you could potentially just, if you have an ASP application, you can just say update state whenever you get new requests. So turning it into something simple is a huge part of these too, because I was doing these by hand initially and realized that it was going to take me every single request I was going to have to validate
Forever.
with a regex
Yeah.
for each one of those, which was not a sustainable model. So we decided to instead update it and add the exploit framework for that, so that each of these hard parts you can see we're all updating state inside of that we're trying to manually handle as well. So like
This is a
those are all
really
things.
this is a really like telling walkthrough of things because as as somebody who's been on the defender side more often than not, this is the kind of logs that get post, get post, get post, put, and I see the put and I'm like, oh no, oh that's bad. And I kind of infer everything else, but like when you have the ASPX files, you don't actually know what they're doing. Like I would never be able to say that like that post was creating an account confidently from the logs. I could infer that that's what's going on if I'm like intimately familiar with the software, but like all of these things just kind of add up in my head on the defender side as activity that's most likely bad. Like I don't know all of the terrible things that they're doing.
I mean, to reinforce that a little bit too, from a defender side of things, what they're oftentimes getting is just like a web server logs, like IIS
Yep.
or something like that. Those are not going to have that post data involved, which is why I think the Mandiant blog was the way it was, is because they were just
Yeah.
looking at those requests to those specific ones, and they probably didn't have access to the actual post. I mean, frankly, you don't want to be logging those most of the time, because if an attacker comes around and gets free cookies for your application,
Yeah.
you don't want that either. So like it's pretty common to not have those requests in there. And I think if you were to compare and say that if you didn't have the data from those post and put requests, that you might infer that same graph from that Mandia ended up developing, which misses the parts in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is pretty complex.
Uh,
Nice work.
it, you were using ESET as your AV option.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is it had it enabled by default. So one of the things that that's what the attacker actually did as well. One of the complex components of that was that we ended up having to the way that the AV was triggered is it runs just a single file. It doesn't allow parameters. It just says just run this file. So we had to figure out how to also just run one file in there. So our upload path was actually to upload a bat file to the C drive in the TrioFox one, and then our actual payload for our reverse shell in this our example there, we had like a VBS payload, I think, for our staging, and then you actually modify the AV to point to your bat file, and then you have to upload a file so that it triggers the scan. So like that's a 6-step process in its own right to figure out how to do, and that one comes out in the IOCs if you look at the Mandiant report. The Mandiant report calls out pretty much a similar type of process, which is interesting because like that was a far flung part of the actual like. It's clear that they figured out how to mount something from that because they were able to upload those in a very similar type of way, but that was missed in some of those components.
Hmm.
So yeah, and we kind of went over this already, but essentially turns into that 3 additional requests turn to a total of 26 full requests versus the 5 that were represented in Mandiant, which is a pretty good example of like what we see as attackers is people tend to use like these just statements, and they see that say things are easy, like these are just web requests, which you do all the time. They're really
Right.
common, but the all of those pieces kind of have to come together to coalesce into a real exploit for real attackers. And it would be fascinating to see what like the real attackers did, because they may have found things that I didn't. Because when I was doing the reverse engineering on the target, it was very complex. They've clearly done a lot of work on that product.
Yeah,
I mean, it seems
John in the
fun.
chat mentioned in yeah, remote access products mentioned some of the use of the exploit for setup, Zoho Assist, and AnyDesk remote access. So
I'm a little too
uh,
crusty for some of that. I like my reverse shells and my my callbacks. I was definitely not setting up remote assistance. I see the remote assistance, and I do wonder if it was a ransomware focus, because that oftentimes can be, some of those groups will do it. They'll offshore some of that. Uh,
That's what my guess would be.
And I think we covered this as
Yeah, we
well.
did kind of cover some of
Uh,
that. I dove right into it.
no, it's great. It's great. And I would encourage people to, like any questions. I think there's been some good discussion as we're talking. But yeah, if anyone has questions for Kale, want to open that up as well. Hey, one other
Yes.
thing, like from the exploit, then my assumption is you went and built detections. What does that look like?
Yeah, for this one, we ship off PCAPs and Suricata, Snort, Yara, and Sigma rules for all of these. So these ones were written for each of those. I tried to minify to the point where we could recognize the different parts of the steps involved here, because some of the, like the put requests, for example, were totally normal requests. You would see those all the time, ironically, on the application, because that's just how it does the requests in general. So the first step we had to do was like the initial CV, because that CV is that first step of the local host redirecting to administrator, was the core of the vulnerability. That was the root cause of where this all comes from. And so we had to take it and figure out which steps we could detect and were important to detect and not give false positives. Because if someone was setting this up for the first time and had our products deployed, I wouldn't want it to detect when they're setting it up, for instance. False positives are the devil. So we tried desperately to only focus on the components that were going to be used by the attacker. So some of those were focused on the checking for local host, or the host header was set to not the target, for example, was one of our Suricata and Snort rules. Some of those also included Sigma rules. So if we saw that Trio Fox was spawning ESET, which was then spawning, a base set of things, that was a bat file that was not in certain paths, because by default it sets to that. And I looked at the ESET nod, like where it actually installs by default, and if it didn't match that path, triggering on those as potentials. For Suricata and Snort, we're very, very picky, but for Sigma, we allow a little bit more flexibility for like, hey, this is a potential, and so we could flag those as potential targets and potential callback locations where an attacker has already gotten to that point. So there was a few steps in there. I think the antivirus one was a set of the steps. The uploading a specific like bat file into the drive from TrioFox from like a specific set of components was a flag for detections. And then the admin, like that whole admin database side of it, should not have had a host header set. So we had about like 3 detections, I believe, for just web requests, and like 2 or 3 for the Sigma rules. I believe was how we ended up developing for that.
Nice. Yeah, that's interesting to get some insight into the detection side. So,
Yeah, I mean that's
cool.
why we do the exploitation like that as first principles. Functionally, we think that exploitation is a requirement to get some of these high signal noises for all of this detection mechanism. We ended up getting a lot of information about this that was going to be missed if you didn't actually do it with an exploit itself for real.
Yeah. When you say
Right.
first principles, for the people who are listening, or later on listening, like, what do you mean when you say first principles?
I essentially mean that to not be too tooting the horn of attackers a little bit here too much, but I think that if you're thinking in security and you're not thinking like an attacker, you might be missing some of those core parts of just of the kill chain. I don't like you to use that word, but in general, if you're thinking like an attacker, you have a better understanding of how to defend. And so we think the way we develop our signatures and our rules is that exploitation is the core part of the thing. If you can't prove that the exploit actually does what it does, which is why we're an initial access team, we focus on only remote code execution, info leaks, things that actually give real data to real attackers. I've always said that like I only care about things that someone's going to actually pop in real life. Those are kind of the root of everything we do for our analysis for that. Some of that comes from experience and some of that comes from analysis. We have a lot of different ways of doing that, But yeah, PR in. If someone says there's no authentication required, I'm cracking my knuckles and I'm digging in immediately. Or if they say there's authentication and wrong, which happens a lot.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
exploitation from first principles is essentially we build all of our product based on the exploitation step. So if there is not exploitation, we're probably not going to do it unless we have good signals from other parts. Sometimes we get other data and intel that allow us to at least get a lower quality but base signature. So I think that exploitation is a critical component of the of security and defense in general. So that's why we develop this process this way.
Yeah.
One of the things, and it looks like multiple products, but like all of them are Trio Fox. Like I think there's been four Trio Fox Sysadz.
There have to be.
Um, yeah,
Mhm.
I didn't look in VulnCheck to see if there's more. There might or might not be, but um, yeah, my question there, right, is it does appear that it's like, oh, something happens with a piece of software, and then it's just like, oh wow, there's a lot more there from a code perspective that gets owned. Um, like, what's your experience there? Like, do you think there's going to be a lot more follow on with Cloudnet, Trio Fox regarding other similar vulnerabilities? You can talk maybe more broadly about this with software, but
Yeah.
curious your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think this one was also particularly interesting because they share a lot of code base with their other products. It seems like they kind of build one core set of like features, and then that ships out with some of the other products. I don't know what the full deployment process looks like, but so Center Stack was one of their other products. It turns out to have a nearly exactly identical code base to some of the Trio Fox stuff. So there was a Center Stack vulnerability that ended up using the exact same thing. And in fact, for this vulnerability, I'd mentioned some of the other researchers published information about it. They ended up actually going to the exact same path that Trio Fox, that the not Trio Fox, the Center Stack component used. So they actually had already triaged that vulnerability and realized that it shared the same code bases and they could go that path. And so they went straight through that path. So it shared all the same things. And part of the reason that you see these like kind of cascading vulnerabilities is because a lot of times people aren't looking. Researchers are, we only have a certain amount of time in our day, and when someone asks us to go and look through something, suddenly people start poking around and they start
Yeah.
having a bunch of other.
Yeah.
I mean, a perfect example was today was the smarter tool, smarter mail
Yeah.
one that
Yeah.
we ended up co-finding a vulnerability of remote code execution in it for unauth remote code execution. Four other researchers had found and reported to it that we ended up having a collision of the vulnerability when trying to assign the CVE because
Yeah.
just people started looking and no one was looking before. So it is kind of an interesting cascade of low-hanging fruit finding when people end up trying to dig into these. Some of that can be it's not a true fire thing. I was not certain with some of these I've found in the past that people were going to find them without digging for deeper. And so sometimes when one researcher finds something, it just gets people interested in it. You see a goofy vulnerability and you think, oh, maybe there's more. And so some researchers
Yeah.
go and dig in. We're pretty easy to nerd snipe. So we see a fancy thing. And I mean, just look at the React to Shell stuff. Every researcher
Oh
under the
yeah.
sun came out of the woodworks. And it's
Yeah.
partially that goes there too. And honestly, sometimes the products end up getting better because they realize they need to do
Yeah.
security research in themselves and hire some pen testers. And sometimes they don't get better, and you start seeing Fortinet vulnerabilities for decades and decades and decades.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, I think
It
that's
comes in
one of the
waves.
that's one of the, I don't know, funnest parts of being in this industry in particular is like the seeing the first part of like somebody has found something interesting and novel here and then like the follow on to everything else. Like that's truly like my favorite part of all of the big emerging threat things is just like it gets the research community excited about it. I think people learn a lot from it. So like you get you get the kids who are like just coming into the industry, like tearing these things apart and like they're learning because of all of the research that has been done on these things. So it's like, it's all around good. There's just so much
So
software out there now.
I think on your note too, I think one thing is sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, something's being exploited. I have no idea what this software is. It seems to happen a
Hmm.
lot with file sharing in the last 2 years. And maybe some other areas too. But yeah, I do think it's like when there's one, you might want to be ready for more. Keeping an eye on advisories, patches, that sort of stuff, because it does tend to appear to come in waves. Um, uh, in these types of instances. So, and I
Yeah.
assume too, like we're talking on the researcher side, but I'm assuming as well, there's threat activity, then that's detected. Probably other threat actors are interested in that threat activity, and probably do their own research. Like it goes both ways. So,
It's like
um,
art, it's just like a persistent circle of inspiration from one another.
There are like smell
well,
tests and indicators too that make you want to dig into other things, and sometimes that like exposes an entire ecosystem to researchers that they didn't know exist. Like I spent most of my time in pen testing recognizing that the business to business software is deployed all over the place, but no one has any idea exists. Those are my favorite targets, and attackers are thinking that exact kind of way.
Yeah.
They might not know those exist and are well adopted, and suddenly they start looking in there, and it becomes a known thing. Swift in the banking world became a huge target
Oh,
because that, but it was
yeah.
all over the place and no one had looked at it. And then it got in the news and then it's suddenly heavily scrutinized. So sometimes it's like even categorical things that just people don't know well for soft that are like ubiquitous or favorite attacker targets.
that's great. Hey, so we're approaching the near the end. We have a few more things we want to talk about. So Kimber, I think you just wanted to highlight some of the new work we've been
Yes.
doing with our
Yes.
canary intelligence, which
I
maybe you can talk about the mail. Oh gosh, what was the mail
Smarter
Smarter
smarter?
mail.
tools, smarter men.
Yeah, what's going on with that?
Yeah.
Tell us about these
So,
canaries.
one of our most, I don't know, important. I'm gonna call it most important. Yeah, one of our most important features of VulnCheck, most important products is our VulnCheck Kev, where we keep track of all of the references of known exploited vulnerabilities. And just in case you missed it, VulnCheck fans, we introduced VulnCheck Canaries recently, and it's a product in itself, but it does enhance the VulnCheck Kev as well. So these are intentionally vulnerable systems that Kale and the initial access team develop when they're researching these exploits. And we put those all over the world so that we can capture real attacker behavior on that real software. Benefit of this is that we get the actual payloads, the IPs, geolocation, the evolution of that exploitation behavior becomes, telemetry associated with the CVE. So that community members get to see a benefit in there's like a true false vulncheck canary seen or not in that vulncheck kev entry on a CVE so that you can know like hey, this is first party intelligence that vulncheck is providing to you that we've seen it ourselves verified by our initial access team's detection rules and vulnerable systems. And I think also another really interesting thing about that is we're going back and making our rules better because of it. I recently learned in the last couple of weeks. I think some detections have already been improved that catch other variations. Kale, true, false, maybe.
Yeah, no, it is.
Sweet. So that leads me into the next part of this, which is soon Patrick will be speaking about the state of exploitation. Um, yeah.
Not, is that now?
No, it's not now.
Oh, good.
I you click on the next slide, there's like a little brief teaser.
Oh,
A
oh, all right.
teaser. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I just want
Let's
to
see.
highlight we did release last week's the state of exploitation report in 2026. If you go to our blogs, you can get access there. I think it's in the white papers as well. But yeah, just some different observations from KEVs we added in 2025. Well, just recently we passed 4,500 vulnerabilities in VulnCheck KEV. And I think in the last year it was somewhere around like 887 or something vulnerabilities. Don't correct me if I'm slightly off. But yeah, and explores a few different things. Look at timelines, so how fast the vulnerabilities are being weaponized and used. and exploited. Also took a look at different categories. Um, uh, you know, network edge devices, anything internet facing, CMS, content management systems, open source software, server software, operating systems, right? Like your usual suspects. But the idea and intent there was to provide some guidance around like, hey, you probably should make sure you automate things as much as possible in these areas, when possible, or certainly keep an eye out when there is active exploitation that you're taking care of it quickly. And on the VulnCheck Kev side too, just to put a plug in, we do have alerts. So every time we add a new Kev, you can get Slack or email alerts, which is free, which is pretty cool. That can vary from nothing in a day to, I don't know, I think yesterday
20.
we had like 15 Kevs.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty active. I think early in the year, usually it's a little bit slow, and then it starts to really, exploitation disclosure and activity really picks up this time of year. Everyone's stuck inside. They have nothing to do. It's cold, the whole northern
It's
hemisphere,
frozen.
and they just want to throw some exploits around. That's all.
Well,
So good times.
yeah,
But yeah,
good
check it
times.
out, vulncheck.com. And then this series we'll be hosting on a monthly basis. Next month we have a new report coming out from VulnCheck with Caitlin. I think Jake is working on it.
Yeah,
Not
Caitlin
going
and
to drop
Jake.
names or any details, but I'm sure we'll be talking about things like exploitation. And so the intention next month is we'll be walking through that and talking through the details on that
Yes.
report.
And that'll be on the last Wednesday of every month. So, believe if you subscribe to this one, you'll be subscribed to the series, but don't quote me on that. We're still learning how these things
Yeah,
work.
join us next month. It'll be fun.
Yeah. Kale won't be
But
here, but thank you for joining us today, Kale. I learned a lot and I will be haunted forever. Thank you.
That's all I want in life.
very fun. Thanks,
Wonderful.
everybody. Appreciate everyone that joined. And if you have any questions, don't feel free to, don't hesitate to reach out. I think LinkedIn is a great place for me, Kimber.
Yes.
Kale, you gotta dig to find him.
You gotta send
Yeah.
me the PGP email.
PGP signed email only.
You can ask Patrick to poke me.
Thanks so much, everybody. It's great having you on. Take care.